May 1945 arrived not with celebration but with silence, as Germany lay broken beneath the weight of its own surrender. Entire cities had become skeletons of ash and twisted steel, their inhabitants wandering among the ruins like shadows of a vanished nation. Hunger gnawed deeper than grief, for food was rarer than forgiveness, and survival had become a language spoken only by the desperate. The war had devoured not only armies, but also the ordinary rhythms of existence, leaving behind a landscape stripped of both order and mercy. In the shattered streets of Nuremberg, Cologne, and Munich, smoke still clung to the air, heavy with the scent of burnt bread and plaster dust. Rail lines were severed, fields trampled, and livestock slaughtered, turning fertile provinces into wastelands where nothing grew except despair. Allied soldiers moved cautiously through the debris, encountering civilians whose eyes carried no hostility, only the hollow stare of starvation. Mothers traded wedding rings for potatoes, children scavenged among corpses for crumbs, and men too weak to dig graves prayed for rain that might yield something edible from the soil. Germany's surrender did not end suffering. It only changed its shape, replacing gunfire with hunger and propaganda with silence. Millions of displaced people wandered across the countryside, soldiers returning from the east, freed prisoners, orphaned refugees, and former captives seeking the borders of lost homes. The victors now faced the moral chaos of victory, for feeding the defeated required confronting the humanity of the enemy. Allied trucks brought rations into towns where emaciated hands reached out, trembling, unsure whether mercy was meant for them. American occupation forces established zones of control, dividing the land into fragments of administration and responsibility. In Bavaria, young soldiers, scarcely older than the civilians they guarded, stood watch over ruins that once symbolized an empire's pride. They followed orders written in Washington, yet faced decisions unimagined by command: when to show compassion, when to obey the letter of authority. The lines blurred daily, for the defeated were no longer soldiers, but survivors, their uniforms replaced by rags and hunger. From these ruins emerged countless small stories that history seldom recorded. Acts of kindness, betrayal, and quiet endurance beneath the machinery of occupation. Each was born in moments when exhaustion overcame ideology, and mercy met the ruins of vengeance. Among them began one story that would echo through decades: an American soldier, a starving German woman, and the fragile boundary between salvation and possession. In the spring of 1945, Private Daniel Carter of the 45th Infantry Division walked through the outskirts of a Bavarian town reduced to fragments. The streets were quiet, except for the crunch of glass beneath his boots, each step echoing against the hollow facades of burned houses. A pale mist clung to the morning air, softening the edges of destruction, but not its meaning, for every wall seemed to whisper of lives recently extinguished. The war had ended officially, yet here its breath lingered, heavy and unspent among the bones of civilization. Carter's orders were simple: patrol the area, ensure no remaining resistance, and report the condition of civilian structures. Yet the further he moved from command tents and ration depots, the more those instructions seemed detached from reality. The town was less a place than an autopsy, every street dissected by artillery scars, every window staring back like an unhealed wound. Smoke drifted from the remains of a bakery where rats had replaced customers, and the faint smell of stale flour hung like memory. Nearby, a church bell lay cracked among rubble, its silence louder than any sermon ever preached. He passed a row of abandoned wagons, their wheels half buried in ash, surrounded by broken furniture and the remnants of flight. Scattered photographs, singed at the corners, showed smiling families, now vanished into history's abyss. Occasionally, figures moved at the periphery, elderly men wrapped in torn coats, women clutching bundles of gray cloth, children staring without expression. They did not speak to him, nor did they flee, for exhaustion had consumed fear itself. Each face reflected the quiet question none dared voice: whether mercy still existed among the victors. Carter adjusted his rifle strap and continued toward the outskirts, where barns and orchards once marked the village's prosperity. Now only crows inhabited the fields, circling over carcasses of horses that had died harnessed to empty carts. He paused at a crossroads littered with military helmets, both German and American, stripped of insignia by scavengers. War's equality lay in ruin, where no symbol retained meaning beyond decay. The silence pressed upon him, drawing thoughts he could neither articulate nor dismiss. As daylight faded, a sound broke through the stillness, a faint rustle beneath a collapsed barn ahead. Carter turned, hand on his weapon, listening. The noise came again, fragile, human, and unmistakably desperate. He approached slowly through the dust and shadows, unaware that this single moment, born of instinct and duty, would forever alter the course of his peace. Beneath the charred skeleton of what had once been a Bavarian barn, Private Carter knelt beside the sound that had pierced the silence. The beams were blackened, collapsed inward like broken ribs, and beneath them something moved faintly, a human shape trembling in the dust. He brushed away ash with the butt of his rifle, and a pair of eyes opened, gray as winter rain, wide with hunger and disbelief. She was young, though starvation had carved years upon her face, her hair matted, her uniform ragged beyond recognition. In the dim light, she resembled not an enemy, but a remnant of war's forgotten debris. When Carter spoke, his voice was cautious, almost reverent, as though language itself might shatter her fragile hold on existence. She did not answer, only stared, clutching a torn satchel against her chest, as though it contained her final fragment of dignity. The insignia on her sleeve was faded, marking her as part of a forced labor unit attached to a retreating German detachment. Her body bore the unmistakable geometry of starvation, sharp bones, hollow cheeks, and hands trembling as if memory alone kept them alive. The stench of decay hung around her, mixed with damp straw and smoke. He lowered his weapon, removing his canteen, and extended it toward her. For a long moment, she hesitated, suspicion and desperation locked in silent conflict. Then, driven by instinct stronger than fear, she crawled forward and drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. The act seemed almost sacred in its simplicity, bridging two worlds divided by months of killing and command. Carter watched, uncertain whether he had just saved a life or violated some unspoken boundary between victor and vanquished. She coughed violently, then collapsed at his feet, her strength spent in that single act of trust. The barn's silence returned, broken only by the distant echo of artillery from mountains, still contested beyond the horizon. Carter knelt again, checking her pulse, finding it faint but present. He looked toward the empty fields where no one would see, then back at her, this nameless ghost of an empire reduced to hunger. Orders had not prepared him for this, for the sight of survival stripped of nationality and uniform. Lifting her gently, he carried her toward the road, his mind divided between duty and conscience. Somewhere within that ruin, the line separating rescuer and occupier began to dissolve, leaving only two souls bound by the simplest truth. Both had survived too long to let the other die. Night descended over the Bavarian hills, turning the landscape into a chiaroscuro of moonlight and ruin, as Private Carter carried the woman toward his unit's temporary camp. The air smelled of rain and burnt hay, a reminder that peace had not yet learned to breathe freely among the ashes. Her weight was barely that of a child, her body limp, her breath shallow against his chest. He could feel the tremor of her heartbeat, slow, uncertain, yet obstinately alive. In that fragile rhythm, he sensed something that orders could neither command nor erase: humanity's final pulse amid conquest. Carter knew the regulations with precision, for they were repeated each morning in the monotone of command briefings. Allied soldiers were forbidden to harbor enemy personnel, even those unarmed or incapacitated. The woman should have been handed to military police, processed as a prisoner, and confined within one of the overcrowded compounds established beyond the town. Yet as he approached the edge of camp, the glow of lanterns flickering between supply tents, a cold realization settled over him. If he surrendered her now, she would not survive the night. Bureaucracy had no space for frailty, and mercy was not listed among authorized rations. He detoured toward a storage shed at the perimeter, where spare blankets and tools were kept under loose supervision. Inside, the air was damp and filled with the scent of oil and wood shavings. He laid her gently upon a folded tarpaulin, covering her with his field jacket. When she stirred faintly, he pressed a biscuit into her palm, watching as she crumbled it slowly between trembling fingers. Her eyes met his briefly. No gratitude, only disbelief, as though kindness itself had become unimaginable. That silent exchange bound them more tightly than any spoken word. Hours passed while Carter sat nearby, cleaning his rifle out of habit rather than necessity. The camp beyond carried on in muted rhythm, guards shifting, engines rumbling, officers speaking in low tones about reconstruction and repatriation. Yet inside that shed, the war felt suspended, replaced by something quieter and infinitely more perilous, the act of defiance disguised as compassion. He understood that discovery would mean reprimand, perhaps court-martial, yet reason bowed before the instinct that she must live. Outside, dawn began to pale the horizon, illuminating the ruins with reluctant light. Carter watched her sleeping form and knew the truth no manual could define. Sometimes obedience preserves order, but disobedience preserves the soul. Days lengthened into a fragile rhythm within the quiet edges of the occupation camp, where Private Carter and the woman existed between discovery and survival. The shed became their unspoken refuge, a place neither sanctioned nor entirely hidden, shielded by silence rather than secrecy. Each morning, Carter brought remnants from the mess, stale bread, bruised apples, tins of beans, disguising his purpose beneath routine patrols. She accepted them without words, her hands still trembling, her eyes cautious, yet slowly awakening to the memory of being alive. Hunger retreated, but left behind its shadow, an unease that lingered even in stillness. Her name, when she finally spoke it, was Annalisa. The syllables carried an accent both delicate and fractured, shaped by exhaustion more than fear. She told him she had been conscripted from a textile factory near Dresden, marched west as the front collapsed, abandoned when her guards fled. The story emerged in fragments, each detail carrying the cold precision of memory, unsoftened by emotion. Carter listened quietly, uncertain whether his role was confessor or accomplice. In his presence, she seemed both wary and dependent, drawn to the safety he offered, yet frightened by its cost. Outside their hidden corner, the occupation moved forward with bureaucratic rhythm, requisitions signed, civilians processed, curfews enforced. Rumors drifted among soldiers about fraternization, black market exchanges, and courts-martial for those too kind to the defeated. Carter felt their words like distant thunder, a warning of how fragile his secret mercy remained. He told himself he was only keeping her alive until proper aid arrived, yet each passing day deepened the quiet bond that neither sought nor understood. Their existence became a study in restraint, where silence served as language and each shared glance carried forbidden weight. At night, the shed filled with the sounds of rain tapping against warped boards, mingling with the faint murmur of wind across distant ruins. Sometimes she hummed softly, melodies without words, remnants of a world that once believed in tomorrow. Carter would sit beside the door, rifle across his knees, feeling both protector and prisoner of his own decision. In that dim, uncertain space, trust grew not through affection, but necessity, born from two lives suspended between command and conscience. Outside, spring began to thaw the land, but within their refuge, the season felt hesitant, as though time itself feared to move forward without first deciding what mercy truly meant. By midsummer of 1945, the ruins surrounding the Bavarian town began to stir with the uneasy pulse of reconstruction. Yet within the quiet perimeter of the occupation camp, Private Carter's defiance grew heavier with each passing dawn. Annalisa had regained enough strength to stand unaided, her face no longer ghost-like but marked by the wary alertness of someone waiting for consequence. The shed that had once felt like sanctuary now carried the echo of confinement, its shadows deepening with every rumor that reached Carter's ears. Authority, though invisible, lingered everywhere, written in reports, whispered in corridors, and reflected in the eyes of soldiers who watched too long. Fraternization, they called it, a term colder than sin, denoting neither compassion nor lust, but the contamination of discipline by human feeling. Men had been transferred, demoted, even imprisoned for less, and Carter knew his secret could not remain untouched forever. Yet it was no longer simple pity that tethered him to Annalisa. He brought her blankets, then books scavenged from the local schoolhouse, and soon conversations replaced silence. She spoke cautiously, testing the boundaries of his kindness, while he found himself listening as though her voice absolved the chaos still echoing inside him. The war had ended, but its authority persisted, demanding obedience even from conscience. At times she flinched when he approached too suddenly, her instincts sharpened by captivity and hunger. At others, she lingered near him longer than necessity required, as if acknowledging that survival had bound them through a fragile claim neither understood. Carter sensed the shifting weight between them. Protector, captor, accomplice, all roles distorted beneath the blurred morality of victory. Guilt crept in subtle forms, a hesitation before touch, a tightening of breath when footsteps passed outside, an awareness that mercy could resemble control when seen through another's eyes. Beyond the camp, Allied administrators drafted decrees defining justice, reparations, and citizenship, yet inside that shed, law and emotion collided without precedent. The soldier who had saved a life now guarded a secret that no tribunal could classify. He told himself he was ensuring her safety, though the tone of his own voice betrayed uncertainty. Each gesture, offering food, granting warmth, commanding silence, became both compassion and ownership, tangled like the ruins surrounding them. As twilight fell across the valley, Carter realized that power's shadow did not vanish with surrender. It merely changed its uniform, settling quietly upon those who believed they acted in mercy's name. By late summer, the fragile quiet that had protected Private Carter and Annalise began to fracture beneath the weight of rumor and routine. The nearby village, once emptied by retreat and bombardment, had awakened under occupation, its streets filling with traders, priests, and displaced families scavenging through the debris of surrender. Whispers traveled faster than rations, woven through bread lines and church pews, speaking of an American soldier who sheltered a German woman in secret. To the hungry, it was scandal. To the resentful, it was betrayal. To those watching from command tents, it was the infection of authority by sentiment. The first suspicion arose when another soldier noticed missing rations, small absences easily explained yet impossible to ignore. Carter felt the shift immediately, the way conversations fell silent when he entered, how officers' gazes lingered longer than before. Annalisa sensed it too, retreating further into the shed's dimness, her voice shrinking to a whisper when he returned each night. The uneasy companionship that had once felt like salvation now seemed a trap built from good intentions. Every act of kindness became evidence, every shared glance a risk measured in whispers and suspicion. Compassion, once pure, had turned into an accusation neither could escape. Outside the camp, villagers gossiped with the cruel precision born of exhaustion, reshaping fragments of truth into moral currency. Some claimed she was his mistress, others that he held her captive, feeding her to ease a guilty conscience. The truth, complex, human, undefinable, found no place among their narratives. Occupation blurred justice and jealousy, turning survival into spectacle. The same people who begged the soldiers for bread condemned one who offered too much. The war had ended, but judgment remained an endless front, waged now in words instead of artillery. Carter's superiors summoned him twice for questioning, their tone polite but edged with bureaucratic steel. He denied the rumors, insisting his patrol duties required extended hours near the storage facilities. Yet as autumn approached, the tension became unbearable. Anneliese began preparing to flee, fearing that exposure would mean imprisonment or worse. On the evening she told him, her voice trembled not with fear, but with resignation, the understanding that gratitude had become dangerous. Carter watched her gather her few belongings beneath the fading light and realized mercy had never been theirs to define. It belonged to the observers, those who would remember compassion not as virtue, but as defiance against the order built from victory's pride. Autumn's chill crept through Bavaria with the same precision as military order. And for Private Carter, the season brought reckoning rather than relief. The whispers that had followed him for weeks reached the ears of command, carried by jealous subordinates eager for promotion or absolution. One gray morning, as fog rolled across the encampment, he was summoned to headquarters, his rifle confiscated, his expression unreadable. The inquiry was brief in language, yet heavy in implication, conducted by men whose uniforms gleamed with authority, untouched by empathy. In their ledgers, mercy required classification. In their eyes, compassion resembled weakness disguised as rebellion. Carter answered carefully, recounting that he had discovered a civilian in distress and provided temporary assistance pending official transfer. The officer across the table listened without expression, his pencil scratching methodically across a page already heavy with preconceptions. They spoke of discipline, chain of command, and the danger of fraternization eroding post-war order. To them, victory demanded distance, not empathy. The war had ended militarily but persisted bureaucratically, ensuring every act carried consequence measured in rank and obedience. His words, though truthful, collided with regulations designed to preserve hierarchy rather than humanity. Each sentence tightened the invisible rope binding his conscience to authority's verdict. Meanwhile, Anneliese had vanished before dawn, slipping through the forest beyond the camp's edge, carrying with her a single blanket and a handful of rations. Whether out of fear, guilt, or reluctant mercy toward the man she endangered, no one could know. Soldiers sent to verify Carter's account found only footprints dissolving into the mud, evidence both damning and inconclusive. In the official report, she became a displaced person of uncertain origin, her humanity replaced by administrative terminology. Carter signed the document without hesitation, though each letter felt carved into something far deeper than paper. Days later, the verdict arrived, not imprisonment, but reassignment to logistical duty several towns away, stripped of field privileges. It was punishment cloaked as transfer, discipline delivered without spectacle. Among fellow soldiers, he became a warning rather than a man. In private moments, he wondered whether Anneliese had survived or vanished like so many between borders and rumors. Yet beneath regret lived a quiet certainty that he had chosen conscience over compliance, and though it cost him his peace, it preserved something war could never reclaim. The uniform remained, but the illusion of moral clarity had been permanently undone beneath that burned Bavarian barn. In the waning light of 1946, the Allied zones pulsed with the uneasy rhythm of recovery, yet for Anneliese, liberation arrived as a question rather than an answer. Her escape from the camp had led her through forests, refugee caravans, and abandoned rail depots where languages collided in desperation. She found temporary refuge in a convent near Regensburg, its walls echoing with hymns for peace few yet believed. There, among widows and displaced girls, she learned to speak again without trembling, though each word carried the memory of a foreign voice whispering mercy in a ruined barn. Freedom, she discovered, bore its own burden of shame. The nuns asked no questions, accepting her as another lost remnant of empire and defeat. She worked in the kitchens, stitched habits, and carried bread to orphaned children too hungry to remember sides. At night, when the candles guttered, she would lie awake, hearing rain strike the roof with the same rhythm that once marked Carter's footsteps outside their shelter. Gratitude and guilt entwined like vines around her conscience, for survival felt borrowed, not earned. She could not decide whether he had saved her from death or merely postponed its quieter form, existence stripped of belonging. The war had ended on paper, but within her, it continued as memory's occupation. Months passed, and Europe began reshaping itself through treaties and promises, though the displaced remained its uncounted shadows. Anneliese traveled south with a convoy of laborers, eventually finding work in a textile mill near Augsburg. Her hands, once frail, grew strong again, yet each repetition of the loom's motion summoned the past like a prayer unanswered. Occasionally she glimpsed American jeeps passing along the roads, their white stars gleaming against mud and distance. She never sought him, fearing that recognition would collapse the fragile scaffolding of her rebuilt self. Instead, she carried his image as both burden and compass, proof that compassion existed even within conquest, and that every act of mercy demanded a price. Years later, when officials came collecting testimonies from survivors, she declined to sign her name. Her story, she believed, belonged neither to victors nor victims, but to the silence between them. Yet in the privacy of thought, she offered one confession to the man history forgot: that freedom without remembrance is emptiness, and remembrance without peace is captivity renewed. Thus she walked forward, unrecorded, but never unhaunted by the kindness that saved and condemned her in equal measure. Decades after the smoke cleared and the armies withdrew, historians and archivists began uncovering fragments of stories long buried in military records, personal letters, and local testimony. Among them, one account consistently stood out: a young American soldier who chose mercy over regulation, and a starving German woman whose survival depended entirely on that choice. These documents revealed the nuances lost in official reports, moments where compassion transcended rank, nationality, and ideology, challenging the rigid absolutes historians had long imposed upon the final months of the European war. Private Carter's actions, once questioned and lightly punished, were later re-examined as evidence that human conscience often operates beyond military logic, especially when routine obedience conflicts with survival. Witness statements from surviving villagers, fellow soldiers, and Anneliese herself provided fragments of memory that, when pieced together, demonstrated how an individual's choice could ripple through lives long after the surrender had been signed. His defiance had not been reckless, but moral, reflecting the quiet courage necessary to preserve humanity amid the machinery of occupation. Anneliese, whose life had been spared by this singular act, went on to raise a family, work in rebuilding industries, and quietly pass on the story of survival without bitterness, emphasizing the blurred lines between power and mercy. Scholars later noted how her testimony illuminated the subtle forces at work in post-war zones, where acts of kindness could be misinterpreted as transgression and obedience could become cruelty. The story underscored that history's focus on strategy and casualty often overlooks the intimate human decisions that define moral legacy. Through exhibitions, memoirs, and oral histories collected decades later, the narrative of Carter and Anneliese became emblematic of post-war reconciliation, illustrating that even amid devastation, small choices reverberate with enduring significance. Their encounter forced reconsideration of the boundaries between protector and captor, authority and compassion, showing that survival is not merely physical, but moral. Ultimately, their story reminds the world that mercy cannot be legislated, that human empathy can redefine the contours of duty, and that one act in a burned-out barn can alter the moral landscape of war for generations. History, in turn, is not only written by victories, but preserved by those who dared to save a life when it mattered most.